Hi, my name is Paige Poston. I am recording this on behalf of our group for the Organizational Behavior and Theory class. We chose to do Apple because of how prevalent Apple is in our modern world. If we don't own an iPhone, someone we know owns an iPhone. So we thought it would be really interesting to look at how that company is organized and what their culture is like to produce such innovative technology and then market it so well that almost nobody can live without their Apple devices. So first we're going to be looking at a brief history of Apple Incorporated. Apple was founded in 1976 by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne. They launched the first Apple computer in July. Wozniak was in charge of the engineering and Jobs coordinated the sales of the device. In 1985, almost a decade later, there was a power struggle between Jobs and then CEO John Sculley. The board of directors wanted Sculley to, quote, handle Jobs, and Jobs tried to oust Sculley when he found out. Sculley then partnered with the board of directors to remove Jobs for any managerial responsibilities, and Jobs, when he found out, resigned in 1985, starting Next Inc. After Jobs left in 1985, Apple adopted a high right policy targeting power users, but that strategy backfired because lower priced computers in the market were more appealing to most consumers. So Sculley was replaced by Michael Spindler after a few years of low sales. Spindler only lasted 3 years. He was replaced by Gil Amelio in 1993. And after a few more years of low sales, Amelio made the decision to purchase Next and welcome Steve Jobs back as an advisor. Amelio was then fired in 1997, and Jobs acted as interim CEO. When Steve Jobs came back in 1997, he really ushered in an era of innovation. He launched the iMac, one of the more popular desktop computers, in 1998, and then the iBook and the Airport in 1999. With those devices, there was an almost immediate increase in profits. He really wanted to make the computer smaller, which other computer manufacturers were not doing at the time. He introduced iPod in 2001, and that really changed how Apple looked at consumer products. And the next decade really focused on innovation with the introduction of all the generations of iPod, the MacBook, the iPhone, and the iPad, which were two devices that had never been seen before. We chose to include this quote because it really highlights the difference between how Jobs led the company and how soon-to-be CEO Tim Cook leads the company now. As it says, Cook trusted his employees to make the right decisions rather than kind of pulling the strings like Jobs did. In the last few years of his life, Steve Jobs was in pretty poor health, so Tim Cook took over as CEO on August 24th of 2011. Just a few months later, Steve Jobs died, unfortunately, and after that, critics started suggesting that Cook couldn't sustain the innovation that was so prevalent in Apple's company. He proved those critics wrong for the most part, because of the next couple years, Apple introduced big changes to the iPhones, including the general shape and large changes to the design and the camera, things like that. They also introduced the Apple Watch, Apple Music, Apple Pencil, the iPad Pro, and the AirPods, which are all innovative technologies. The number of employees increased under Cook by more than 5 times from 2007 to 2015. And the organizational structure and culture faced pretty major changes overall. So in the early years of Apple, we kind of covered this in the history, but it was a startup, so there was a really small number of employees, allowing for collaboration and innovation, and it was departmentalized into engineering under Steve Wozniak, and then kind of everything else under Jobs. He was the salesman, the idea man, basically everything that made up Apple. When Jobs came back as CEO in 1997, he became the center of the wheel again. Everything went through him. He controlled every aspect of the company. And while decision making was quick, decisions weren't made without Steve Jobs. And in that aspect, the structure really resembled that of a startup, even so many years later. In fact, several of the sources that we came across in the researching of this project refer to Apple as the world's largest startup. And because he was the center of the wheel, it very much resembled the real structure that we learned about in one of the chapters of the textbook. The big things to note with the key elements under Jobs are high specialization, high departmentalization, and a clear chain of command. These things make it very clear who is in charge and who should be held accountable should something go wrong. I couldn't find very much on the span of control for this time. It was likely narrow just because of the departmentalization and the number of employees. Since Jobs kind of ran everything, the centralization is very high, but there was a lot of autonomy and a lot of creativity, so formalization is relatively low. So under Cook, the structure changed, but only slightly. So there were small but significant changes under Cook. The structure became less centralized, and there was less of a hierarchy. But with that, there was a creeping bureaucracy in the company. He lets the senior executives run more of the company rather than everything having to go through him all of the time. He lets them call the shots. It's more like the simple structure than the wheel, in my opinion, because he kind of oversees everything, but not everything has to go through him all the time. To note with the key elements under Cook is the specialization, departmentalization, and chain of command remain unchanged for the most part. So accountability is still very important, and specialization is still very important. The span of control is likely wider just because of the increase of employees, and centralization changed slightly because he lets the VPs run a little bit more of the company. Formalization is probably still low just because they are such an innovative company, but it's probably slightly more so than before because with that many employees, you have to have some kind of formalization to it. We'll take a look at the culture at Apple. So the culture at Apple was definitely influenced by Jobs. He was described by Ronald Wayne as cold, demanding, serious, competitive, and strategic. He majorly focused on innovation, but he had tunnel vision, so he could only focus on one thing at a time. There was a story told about how if they were having a meeting on enterprise, he would only talk about the new gadget they were working on over in R&D. He was also a perfectionist, so he had a major attention to detail in everything that he did. He was described by one man as a high-maintenance coworker. And so these things kind of give you an idea of how Jobs interacted and how that might have an impact on the culture at Apple. Core values under Jobs is innovation, of course, creativity, swift decisiveness, competition, accountability, and collaboration. I looked at the 7 primary characteristics Innovation, of course, is high because they are on the cutting edge of technology most of the time. The attention to detail is high because every part of any Apple product is looked at. It's not on accident, it's always on purpose. Outcome orientation, I kind of had a guess here. I would say it's likely moderate because they have an idea of the product that they want and how it's going to look, but they want to make sure they get there in the right way. So it's not, the ends justify the means. It's the ends and the means have to work together. People orientation is likely high because they really value their employees and the employees really value the company. Team orientation is high. Each department works very well together and the teams interact very often. Aggressiveness is probably mixed and stability is moderate but likely committed to growth. Apple really values its employees, so they express that by offering material rewards like the Top 100 program, in which the closest 100 employees gathered with Steve Jobs to discuss the future of the company. Things like the Employee Purchase Program, which gives them discounts on stocks and devices, and an improved quality of life, including easier commutes with a shuttle, subsidized lunches, and regular beer bashes where musical guests can and sometimes do perform. But employees also really value working for Apple. So some of the things that they see as perks are the atmosphere, which is more mature than other companies in the Silicon Valley. The status that they get from working at Apple. One person described it being as he was treated like a rock star when walking into a retail store, which I thought was pretty funny. And also other employees or employers will see that on a resume and become very impressed that they are interviewing a former Apple employee. They also see themselves as leaving an impact on the world through the types of devices that they help create. And they really value the autonomy that they get from working at Apple. Tim Cook brought a lot of new values to the company, including a very strong sense of corporate responsibility. He started giving under corporate philanthropy. He encouraged employee giving. He is an advocate for social justice issues like LGBT rights. He is the first openly gay CEO. He also advocates for female representation on Wall Street and workplace diversity. He also feels that he needs to set an example, and Apple needs to set an example for sustainability by creating a greener workplace. And he really works to promote others. For example, in the annual keynote presentation, he shares the stage with other senior executives, something that Steve Jobs didn't do much of during his tenure. I found the organizational structure at Apple really interesting. I think that going forward, I'll be watching a little more closely than I have in the past. Jobs' focus on innovation is something that is inherent to the company. If it goes away, the company goes away, I feel like. And Cook's added value, things like corporate philanthropy, he is now paying his stockholders dividends. Those things make it a more traditional company rather than the world's largest startup. So I think that if they can somehow merge those two, they could create the perfect company if the focus on innovation is upheld and if they incorporate some of Tim Cook's ideas.